So the format for this afternoon will be, I'm going to briefly introduce each of our speakers. Then two of our speakers and I will disappear, and the speaker speaking will stand behind the podium. When she is finished, then I'll come back and introduce the next speaker. And then after each of the speakers speak, we will come back here, and I'll take questions, and I'll moderate and see if we can go further. I just want to, before we begin, let me introduce from the right, your right to left, Teresa Konchik from Florida State University, Rachel Brown from the Smithsonian Institution and Goucher College, and Lisa Huckroth from the Université de Poitiers. And we found out that her university is 100 years younger than the University of Bologna where I teach, and so I win. The second oldest in Europe. Okay, I think then why don't we take our seats and let's hear from Teresa. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As I was introduced, I'm Teresa Konchik. I also would like to point out that I am a graduate of the Seton Hall University program in museum professions, and I also taught at Seton Hall a course in legal issues and ethical issues for museum professions for many years, which leads me to say, thank you, that I am an attorney, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to be talking about legal stuff this afternoon, so important legal stuff. Oh, now you threw me for a loop. Thank you. Great, thank you. Okay. On April 14th, 1915, 21 drawings and paintings were removed by censors from an exhibition at the Municipal Art Gallery in the all-girls school of Washington Irving High School in New York City. The banished works include figures extensively undraped, and the school's principal explained, "We find that the present exhibition does not help our girls from an educational standpoint. It is meant for more mature minds." The New York Times questioned the deletions, noting that the spirit of Newport, which is displayed up on the slide, was excluded, yet others displaying equally nude images remained in the exhibition. The Times said, "It is said that there are several nudes in the permanent exhibition of painting in the school building, yet they were not removed." Foster Gilroy, the general manager of the publication Puck, which provided the works, observed, "There was no mention whatsoever of the fact that this exhibit was likely to be censored." The 1915 Washington Irving High School incident is an early example of content-based and viewpoint-based censorship or discrimination of what was deemed to be offensive subject matter of artistic works. Would such censorship be permissible today under legal guidelines? Well, a relevant precedent in this regard is the Supreme Court case that was decided in 1991, Rust v. Sullivan, where the court outlined the extent of proactive First Amendment governmental restrictions on uses of public subsidies and benefits. This presentation today will explore whether, as some have argued, the ramifications of this decision apply to works of art and university funding, and its application to the recent censorship of, or let's say, removal of works from Hide, Seek, Difference, and Desire in American Portraiture. We could also look to subsequent cases that refine the position of the Supreme Court with regard to government expression under the First Amendment and governmental conditioning of the uses of public funds. A brief review of the events surrounding the exhibit is in order. I know that some of these have been reviewed this morning, but I'd like to just briefly go through some of the facts today. In October 2010, the Smithsonian Institution opened a major exhibition entitled Hide, Seek, Difference and Desire in American Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery. The exhibition was intended to explore such themes as the role of sexual differences in depicting modern America, and significantly how art reflected society's evolving and changing attitudes toward sexuality, desire, and romantic attachment. Hide, Seek aroused great controversy with the public and politicians due to the visual content of some of the works. In particular, one video raised reactions that ultimately led to its removal. At the time, the Smithsonian issued a statement, quote, "One of the exhibition's 105 works, a short segment in a 4-minute video created as a complex metaphor for AIDS, was perceived by some to be anti-Christian. It generated a strong response from the public. We removed it from the exhibition November 30th because the attention it was receiving distracted from the overall exhibition, which includes works by American artists John Singer Sargent, Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, Annie Leibovitz, and Georgia O'Keeffe," unquote. The video in question was an edited version of a short silent film created by the AIDS victim and late artist David Wojnarowicz, entitled "A Fire in My Belly," which included images of ants crawling over a bleeding Christ on the cross. The artist made "A Fire in My Belly" at a turning point. In 1987, his longtime mentor and lover, the photographer Peter Huar, died of AIDS, and the artist himself learned that he was HIV positive. So as of December 1st, 2010, the video was no longer part of the exhibition. Secretary of the Smithsonian, G. Wayne Clough, ordered the video to be removed from the exhibition after complaints were made by the Catholic League and members of Congress, including Representative John Boehner. Not only was this individual work of art targeted for its perceived atrocity, but the museum was also attacked. Representative Jack Kingston, a Republican from Georgia, commented, "This is a museum that gets $5.8 million in taxpayer dollars, and in the middle of a high deficit, 15 million unemployed Americans, they decide to have money to spend like this? This is a museum that, by the way, has next to it a display of the American presidents. On the other side, Elvis, and then you go through this, which is really perverted, sick stuff. Ashes of an AIDS victim in a self-portrait, eating himself, male nudity, Ellen DeGeneres grabbing her own breasts. Lots of really kinky and really questionable kind of art." Our friend Catholic League President Bill Donohue argued that the video contained homoerotic images and called on the House and Senate Appropriations Committee to reconsider future funding for the Smithsonian. However, the Association of Art Museum Directors protested the removal of the work, citing its belief that, quote, "freedom of expression is essential to the health and welfare of our communities and our nation. In this case, that takes the form of the rights and opportunities of art museums to present works of art that express different points of view," unquote. In response, the Smithsonian issued a statement: "We respect the AAMD position and respectfully disagree with their conclusion. As a publicly supported museum, the Smithsonian has an important research and educational mission and needs to be responsive to a large and diverse audience. The change that was made was intended to clear up a misunderstanding and help focus attention on the central theme of the exhibition, which is portraiture and the representation of gay and lesbian identities in American art." The concerns raised over the removal of "A Fire in My Belly" involve the nature of First Amendment applications in the context of an exhibition held in a government-funded institution, such as the National Portrait Gallery. Complicating this application is the fact that Hide-Seek itself was underwritten primarily through private funding sources. In analyzing the legal issues surrounding censorship and restrictions on content, it may be useful to review two Supreme Court rulings that bear on the ability of Congress to establish content-based and viewpoint-based criteria on federally funded projects. These cases are significant because they tell us how the Supreme Court interprets First Amendment freedoms where government funding is concerned. Artistic expression falls under the protections ensured by the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Courts have reviewed both content-based and viewpoint-based discrimination under the First Amendment. Simply put, content relates to the subject matter, and viewpoint relates to opinions expressed. There are two cases I'm going to discuss today that have a somewhat chilling effect that makes me wary about the future of First Amendment freedoms for artistic expression, especially where government funding is concerned. The 1991 case of Rust v. Sullivan involved conditions placed by Congress on the use of public subsidies in the context of family planning services. In 1970, Congress enacted Title X of the Public Health Service Act, which authorizes the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services to make grants to and enter into contracts with public or nonprofit entities to assist in family planning. The Act provides that none of the funds appropriated shall be used in programs where abortion is used as a method of family planning. Regulations that were promulgated under the Act specified that projects receiving Title X funds could not provide counseling relating to abortion or encourage people to seek abortion as their method of family planning. Such services, if offered, must be organized so that they are physically and financially separate from prohibited abortion activities. The petitioners to the court were Title X grantees and doctors who supervised Title X funds on behalf of themselves and their patients and brought suit against the Secretary of HHS, alleging, among other complaints, that the regulations violated the First Amendment rights of Title X clients and healthcare providers by discriminating on the basis of viewpoint. That is, that abortion was wrong. The court disagreed, albeit by a narrow margin, finding that there were no facial violations of First Amendment rights to free speech. Writing for the majority, Justice Rehnquist cited precedent that the government has no obligation to subsidize even the exercise of fundamental rights, including speech rights. Furthermore, challenges to legislative acts require establishing that no set of circumstances exists under which an act would be valid. Here, the court found that the act was indeed valid and did not violate the First Amendment, rejecting the claim that by placing conditions on the receipt of federal subsidies against abortion counseling, Congress was suppressing what might be considered to be dangerous views or ideas. Significantly, the court found the government did not discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. It merely chose to fund one activity over another. Refusal to fund a protected activity without more cannot be seen as placing a penalty on that activity. The government merely refused to fund activities, including speech, that were excluded from the scope of the project being funded. The restrictions on abortion counseling did not in any way prohibit persons from acting as private individuals. Their activities were only limited during the time that they were working on federally funded projects. In a noteworthy dissent, Justice Blackmun stressed that the First Amendment means that the government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. However, he was in the dissent. To date, Rust v. Sullivan is still precedent, and the legal implications of this case suggest that the government can impose restrictions on viewpoint or subject matter speech activity within the scope of federally funded projects. In other words, the government can impose limits on the use of public funds in speech-related activities as long as there is no restriction on an individual's private expression or speech outside the scope of the project. Therefore, one can argue, the government can influence public discourse in the arts, humanities, legal and medical consultations, broadcasting, or other public forums by allocating or refusing to allocate its financial largesse to favored or unfavored activities, respectively. Does this mean that Congress could impose restrictions on the content in government-sponsored exhibitions? Arguably, that's possible. Note that the Smithsonian receives significant funding from the federal government and considers itself to be a federal organization. And for its 2012 budget has requested $797.6 million from Congress to fund operations. All right, so we don't get too depressed yet. I want to point out some exceptions made in the Rust case. Significantly, the court also recognized that restrictions on free speech are not permissible in settings that are traditionally open to the public for expressive activity. Justice Rehnquist wrote, quote, "We have recognized that the university is a traditional sphere of free expression so fundamental to the functioning of our society that the government's ability to control speech within that sphere by means of conditions attached to the expenditure of government funds is restricted by the vagueness and overbreadth doctrines of the First Amendment. Additionally, government subsidies in the form of government-owned property do not justify restriction of speech in areas that have been traditionally open to expressive activities. However, this has been so far limited to public parks and sidewalks, meaning that Congress can't necessarily interfere with your ability to express yourself in Central Park without a reasonable basis. I doubt, however, that the court meant that government-subsidized museums such as the Smithsonian are places that are traditionally open to expressive activities to the public. In a more recent case involving the constitutionality of grant-making procedures for arts funding, the Supreme Court upheld content-based restrictions imposed by Congress. In National Endowment for the Arts versus Karen Finley, a challenge was made by artists that grant-making procedures under the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act violated their First Amendment rights by placing viewpoint-based restrictions on funding. Let's briefly trace the background of this case. A provision of the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act directed the chairperson of the National Endowment for the Arts in establishing regulations and procedures for the approval of NEA grants to ensure that artistic excellence and artistic merit are the criteria by which applications are judged, taking into consideration general standards of decency and respect for the diverse beliefs of the American public. The artists argued that this prescriptive criteria could lead to viewpoint discrimination by the NEA in making grant decisions. It's noteworthy that this requirement was imposed after the Mapplethorpe and Piss-Christ controversies. Well, the court disagreed with the artists. Justice O'Connor, writing for the majority, noted that there was no viewpoint discrimination, as the legislation merely required that general standards of decency be considered. In other words, decency was just one of many factors and not dispositive of funding decisions. Moreover, the court echoed its decision in Rust v. Sullivan that Congress has wide latitude in setting funding priorities. Unfortunately, the court recognized that the standards of decency were imprecise considerations, but allowed them nonetheless. This is troubling in that funding for arts programs could be subject to vague restrictions in the future, yet be upheld as constitutional by the court. Justice Scalia, in a concurring opinion, said that the criteria established by Congress was perfectly clear, and it does establish content and viewpoint-based considerations upon which grant applications are to be evaluated. Decency and the beliefs of Americans are means to judge artistic merit, plain and simple. In fact, Scalia believes that decency must be considered in all evaluations of artistic merit. At the end of the day, we have a legal precedent that supports viewpoint discriminatory legislation, mandating that decency and respect for the diverse beliefs of the American public be considered in grant decisions. Does this mean that religious views, such as a belief in Christianity, must be considered too in the future? Would a pro-gun control work of art be inconsistent with the diverse beliefs of the American public? Unfortunately, this is not the version of freedom of speech under the First Amendment many of us have in mind. At the beginning of this presentation, I made reference to a controversial 1915 art exhibition in a girls' high school that featured nude subjects. The principal then said the subject matter was intended for more mature minds and pulled some of the art from view. I ask, aren't our minds mature enough to view controversial works of art without limitation or censorship today? Will public funding of the arts be eroded to reflect current whims and sensibilities of Congress? And will the Supreme Court uphold those whims and sensibilities? Based upon my reading of these Supreme Court cases, I'm not so sure that true freedom of speech can be guaranteed, especially when government funding is concerned. And if that's the case, I think we face a somewhat sad and discouraging future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now hear from Rachel Brown, who herself is also an attorney and an associate counsel at the Smithsonian, and also in the teaches in the arts management program at Goucher.
Good afternoon. I want to say when I came in this morning and saw who the panelists were this morning and this afternoon's program, I asked myself, how did I get here? I'm so honored and so flattered to be at this program. The topic that I will address over the next 20 minutes is moral rights, free expression, and money, and specifically the ethical implications of a museum's not properly balancing those interests in a controversy over artistic content. After sharing with you two of the reasons for my interest in this topic, I will spend most of my time providing a snapshot of past cases that may provide a historical context for resolving future controversies. But before I begin, I also must share with you the following affirmative disclosure. Any views that I express this afternoon are mine, do not reflect the views of the Smithsonian Institution, the Goucher College, or any other employers, or my family, or my friends, or my colleagues. So that's on record. We got that on record. But there is one statement that I would like to share, which I think many of my colleagues at the Smithsonian will share, and that is just how deeply humbled and honored we are to serve with Monty Sullivan. We're just very, very privileged. And I also appreciate the fact that Marty took the hard questions, the legal questions, on the moral rights issues this morning. So I don't expect to get any questions about that matter. But why this topic? First, I was curious why there was not a greater discussion about a case that David von Orderovich brought over 20 years ago to protect his artistic reputation and copyright. And that case also involved a work by the artist that had an image of a Jesus figure with swarming ants, similar to the image in the Fire in My Belly video. I have included that case in materials for a course that I teach at Goucher on Law of the Arts. I've taught that course for about 3 years now. And it's a great, great case for teaching because it's one of those rare instances where a lone artist sues and then prevails in large part. But also the decision touches upon a large range of legal issues, from copyright infringement, fair use, moral rights, or the New York statutorily equivalent of the moral rights, to the First Amendment rights of the artist's critic to use the artist's work without authorization. The artist's critic, in that earlier case, was Donald Wildman of the American Family Association, and that was in 1989. He had a pamphlet design that cropped and reproduced only fragments of the whole works by the artist that had been included in an exhibit at Illinois State University. The pamphlet was entitled, "Your Tax Dollars Help Pay for These Works of Arts," and stated, among other things, that the photographs appearing on this sheet were part of David Wojnarowicz's, excuse my pronunciation, Tongues of Flame exhibit catalog. The envelope was marked "Caution, contains extremely offensive material." In an effort to stop public funding by the NEA of similar artworks, the American Family Association mailed the pamphlet to 523 members of Congress, 3,230 Christian leaders, 947 Christian radio stations, and 1,578 newspapers. The artists sued Wildman and the association for copyright infringement and violation of the New York Artist Authorship Rights Act. And that act protects an artist's work from being altered or defaced where damage to the artist's reputation is reasonably likely to cause harm. The artist lost on the copyright claim, but on the claim that his art had been misrepresented and his reputation harmed in violation of the act, he won. In 1991, the American Family Association and David Wildman were ordered to stop sending the pamphlet and to send a corrective mailing to each of those who had received one. Because the artist was unable to prove any actual damages, however, were caused by Wildman's harmful conduct, the court did not award any significant damages. In fact, the damage award was for $1. Although not a legal issue in that 1989 case, it is clear from a reading of the court decision that there was never any question about the artistic quality of the artist's work. Which leads me to the second reason for my interest in the topic. In the wake of the hide-and-seek controversy, there were published reports of congressional threats to the Smithsonian Institution's budget. I was not personally concerned, but on November 30th, 2010, a spokesman for then House Speaker designate John Boehner was quoted as saying that Smithsonian officials should either acknowledge the mistake and correct it, or be prepared to face tough scrutiny beginning in January when the new majority in the House moves in. It's a new sheriff in town. In the same news report, then incoming Majority Leader Eric Cantor called for the dismantling of the exhibit and called the exhibit an outrageous use of taxpayer money. Such statements are not new in Washington, but they do generate more concern given the current budgetary situation. But such statements do mean more generally for the museum community, regardless of whether it's in Washington or elsewhere in the country. Museums are uniquely dependent on public funding as compared with other arts organizations. As Stephen Weil has written, such disproportionality creates a dependence on government support and requires that museums keep themselves at all times finely tuned as to how they are perceived, not merely by their visitors, but also by the larger taxpaying public, upon whose goodwill and at least tacit approval they made themselves dependent. Now, as a matter of law, as we learned earlier, the First Amendment is intended to protect museums from having to choose between either self-censoring and chilling the expression of artists exhibiting on their sites, or protecting its own financial self-interest with government funders. But nevertheless, from an ethical perspective, I was interested in exploring a little further, one, what are the prevailing principles concerning free expression, and what are the prevailing principles concerning a museum's obligation to maintain its financial sustainability? Recent dental work, sorry. Secondly, when do those principles apply? And thirdly, in a crisis, which of those principles takes priority? I looked at several sources, but I soon found a very clear answer in the Association of Art Museum Directors' Professional Practices in Art Museums. Under those guidelines, concerns about a museum's financial sustainability or real or perceived threats to funding from governmental or private funders do not overcome an art museum's obligation to respect freedom of expression and the integrity of a work of art. This absolute obligation applies however innovative or unconventional an exhibit may be. But even in the absence of having found an explicit value that may guide a museum in responding to a census call to remove an artwork or to terminate an art exhibition, many people have agreed about what to do in many past cases. One notable such case is the Dallas Museum of Art's 1955 response to calls to remove works from a sports and arts exhibit organized by the American Federation of Arts. In that case and others, the decision to protect the full exercise of free expression was not chilled by concerns about potential funding or other risks, but grounded on very intrinsic and spiritual values. Bell Hook, in her books on Art on My Mind, Visual Politics, wrote, "To truly champion artistic freedom, we must be committed to creating and writing and sustaining an aesthetic culture where diverse artistic practices, standpoints, identities, and locations are nurtured, find support and affirmation, with a belief that individual artists must have the right to create as spirit moves, freely, openly, provocatively prevails. And until this expansive vision of the role of the artist in society is embraced as the necessarily aesthetic groundwork for all artistic practices, freedom of expression will be continually undermined, its meaning and value lost." In other past cases, however, private and public funders play a significant role in dictating how or whether artistic rights are exercised and respected, and will continue to play a significant role until Bell Hooks' expansive vision of the role of the artist in society is embraced. There are nonetheless some significant lessons to be learned from all of these past cases. And I found about 3 or 4 that I would like to share with you. In 1934, the United States Navy removed this image, this work, from an exhibit of WPA artwork at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. The exhibit was organized by the WPA. Criticism of this work was initiated by a writer of a letter to the editor of the Washington, D.C. Evening Star. Subsequent criticism from the public also grew. Secretary of Navy was the responsible authority, and the outcome was that it was removed. And allegedly, it was kept in the custody of either the secretary or the assistant secretary, it's not clear, then went to a private club. But in 1980, in response to a threat to sue, the Navy made the work available for a retrospective of Paul Cadmus's work, The Fleet's Inn. And if you're lucky and you're visiting Washington, D.C., you will have a chance to see this at the Hide and Seek exhibit as well. Case 2. And I apologize for the image, but I grabbed it from the internet. I might have violated someone's moral rights in doing so, but this is what I call the State Department collection, or the Cold War in the Art War. The year is 1946. The exhibition consisted of 79 paintings and watercolors purchased by the government for over $49,000. It was supposed to be part of the State Department travel exhibit to Europe, starting in Prague, and to Latin America, starting in Haiti. Among the artists represented in the exhibit were Stuart Davis, William Roper, Ben Shahn, Romeo Bearden, George O'Keeffe, Arthur Dove, Jacob Lawrence. This is Jacob Lawrence. And Yasui Kuruyoshi, whose work, The Circus Girl Rested, was the subject of a particularly forced criticism. The exhibit was called Advancing American Art. It was planned for 5 years. Initial criticism was initiated by the media, the Baltimore American, followed up by the Hearst newspaper, particularly Look magazine, that wrote a very long article about your money bought these paintings. Allegations were that about 20 of the 45 artists representing the show had communist connections. In some cases, the artists provided illustrations for publications allegedly affiliated with the communists. And this occurred 2 years before the McCarthy Red Scare era. At that time, the Jesse Helms of 1946 to 1956 was Congressman George Donero. And this is this quote that it's been attributed to him in connection with this particular exhibit. Modern art is communistic because it's distorted and ugly, because it does not glorify our beautiful country in plain, simple terms that everyone can understand. It is therefore opposed to our government, and those who created it and promoted it are our enemies. Secretary of State George Marshall terminated the exhibit, which had to come back from Europe, back from Latin America. The works ended up being sold to a series of nonprofit organizations, including Auburn University, at a 95% discount off the price that the government purchased. So Auburn acquired 30 works for $5,000. Oklahoma University acquired 36 works for $1,000. And Mr. Hearst acquired 5 works for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Those works are now valued at over $30 million. William Benton, who was the assistant secretary who approved the purchase, had a rough time on the Hill trying to justify it. And I will conclude very shortly. But this is an exchange that he went through on the Hill with Representative Stephan from Nebraska. Representative Stephan, aren't you horrified by these works? Benton, I would not use the word horrified. Stephan, well, you are shocked, aren't you? Benton, no, I wouldn't say I was shocked. Stephan, well, what would you say? Benton, I would say art. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Lisa Hockroth from University-Newark.
My name is Lisa Hockroth. I'm coming from the Université de Poitiers. Today I'm former editor-in-chief of the International Council of Museums from 2005 to 2009. I'm presently French editor for AFRICOM News, the African Council of Museums. The idea today is, first of all, to thank Sally Yarkovich and the Institute of Museum Ethics and Seton Hall for this initiative, and also the chance to discuss this issue from an international perspective today. Considering the controversy elicited by the exhibition Hide, Seek, Difference, and Desire in American Portraiture, I thought to reflect on this national debate in this international context from 2 points of view and kind of briefly. Not only are there several examples of comparable controversies in museums elsewhere in the world, but some relevant insight into the global museum's perspective also on such ethical dilemmas in today's world of conflicting public interests at the crossroads of institutional politics, art, and religion. In the multimedia expansion of the public sphere, the growing public domain, through print, radio, internet communications, including Web 2, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and Web 3, say Second Life, the viewing public of any given museum exhibition rapidly transgresses and goes beyond the sanctity of the national museum walls and of the museum walls as it is. The global museum community is highly diverse, and yet there are organizations such as the International Council of Museums, which is an international non-governmental organization, and UNESCO, which is an intergovernmental UN agency, in addition to other international organizations such as the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, and no doubt other intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations considering these same questions and trying to develop, in fact, codes of ethics and conventions and international agreement on such subjects. So they are big issues. Some of these organizations have ethics committees, such as ICOM. WIPO has mediation and arbitration services, and there are certainly hundreds of people more competent than I to deal with this particular issue. But I do think it's interesting to look at it as a case study. And a case study in the international context, I think, would bring good development for codes of ethics, ICOM's Code of Ethics, and good development for international conventions and legislation at this time. So it's good to reflect on it. And one of the first things that I've learned in teaching about ethics and heritage is that context is very important. And I think all the debates up till now, discussion this morning, and the co-speakers of this session have gone into detail about the context and the specificity of the case, which is how the general principles will emerge. I'll try to get through what I've got. As it turned out, several American and European galleries exhibited the excised film Fire in My Belly with yank-covered Jesus, which exacerbated the opposition, exacerbated the opposition to an exhibition focusing on difference and desire, as well as the representation of ambiguous gender and sexuality in American portraiture. I think ambiguity is the key focus. Whereas a contemporary or modern art museum might not have had any qualms about exhibiting such a video or such art, when you think of Chip Simon's portrait of Jesus on Jesus Toast, Katarzyna's Kazimierza's Blood Ties, 1995. Jesus Toast is 2005. Image of Jesus on the toast, coming out like. Or Francis Bacon's Three Studies for a Crucifixion, 1965. With that said, the murder of Theo van Gogh due to the public display of his 2005 film portraying Quranic verse on passively posed nudes has brought the life and death issues of artistic freedom to the forefront. The specificity of the realism and representation in portraiture, or perhaps we should say figurative representation, made the content of this show innovative, as well as its self-questioning approach in terms of the institution, the museum institution and the institution of American portraiture, something that the curators undertook to revisit, the genre, the institution, and the national character of both were indeed part of the ambiguities investigated in this, I would say, museological initiative. The cinematic images in Fire in My Belly were indeed a particularly good example of something in excess in the exhibit, a kind of a surreal surplus value of real-life docudrama, autobiographical artistic appropriation of religious and cultural imagery included, which we just saw, alongside the realism of the masterpiece paintings and photographs, realist photographs, articulating differentiations in subjects and subjectivities as created by artists working through classical, modern, and contemporary media. This is not the first time the faces and figures of subjects or the known or assumed sexuality of the artist ended up posing a problem for exhibition organizers, curators, and museum directors, as well as for those pitting religious control of the display of sacred symbolism against the right to freedom of expression and the right to exhibit these works in a national museum context. There are many cases that can be compared but in national museum contexts. The media coverage has now celebrated the ant-covered Jesus that had elicited the opposition of a religious community from the Catholic League and support, or a sector of the Catholic community, in this case, the Catholic League, and support of free speech advocates from artists, curators, and defenders of the right to free artistic expression and decriers of censorship. Several recent international parallel controversies come to mind. In Paris, one revolved around the explicit photographs of the Larry Clark exhibit in Paris, Kiss the Past Hello, which was held at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, Paris's public modern art museum, from October to January in 2011. Clark's photographs of youthful nudes in sexual positions and with erections prompted the city of Paris, the mayor of the city of Paris in particular, who is an open homosexual, to post a ban on visitors under the age of 18. In turn, the ban was opposed, and journalists of the newspaper Libération, for example, were under fire for the equivalent of making much ado about nothing. Another exhibition has been a great success due to the controversial topic of sexuality and youthful target publics. At La Villette Cité des Sciences, also a public institution, right-wingers and parents, the equivalent of the PTA organizations, criticized the exhibition Le Zizi Sexuel, which was a great hit, and many school children learned about sexuality at this exhibit, Le Zizi Sexuel. It was intended for young audiences to learn. It was based on an illustrated guidebook by Zepp and Hélène Brûleur, and the show featured a popular cartoon character, Titeuf, and a cartoon album character, and it attracted a record number of visitors. When there was internal change in direction of the museum, politically motivated, it was temporarily threatened to be closed. But by the end of 2009, the show was actually extended and traveled internationally to Switzerland, for example. In Vienna last year, there was another such controversy regarding the context of the institution concerned at the Succession Museum. I'll quote from the news piece. "A trip to the Austrian capital to see Gustav Klimt's Beethoven frieze will without doubt be a memorable occasion, as the room where the work of art is situated has been turned into a temporary swinger club. The frieze is housed in the Succession building, which is staging a very provocative art exhibition that has aroused mixed reactions in Vienna. Together with Swiss artist Christoph Büchel, the building's management has opened a room for sex culture, partner swapping, S&M machinery, manacle blocks, and gynecological stools, which are just a few of the project's elements that have disconcerted visitors who came to see Klimt's masterpiece." But you might say, that's gay Paris and Austrian trashiness. And this is Washington, D.C., outside in Newark, New Jersey, proper and politically correct southern and northern towns, and a national American museum show meant for all publics. The debate regarding public funding has been covered by my colleagues. I will just mention that they cloud certain issues, in addition, because this was apparently privately funded, but it doesn't really matter in the sense that it is a public institution. In the international context, this is an ethical debate, going beyond a legal debate, which in the case of Poland, Katarzyna Kozra's blood ties, shown at the Zaketa National Gallery of Art, ended up with her being charged in court for blasphemous artistic use of the Greek cross adorned with real nudes. So today's debate is still in the ethical context. Conversely, an exhibition in Amsterdam, the Night Normal exhibition called Difference on Display, Diversity in Art, Science, and Society, had a similar theme to the National Portrait Gallery's Hide and Seek exhibition. This exhibition in Amsterdam highlights for us the importance of context and circumstances for the analysis of ethical cases. Not only did that exhibition ask the question, as per the curator and head of the Night Normal Foundation, Ina Gevers, what is normal and who actually decides this? But the private foundation venue, in this case, was the public stock exchange of Amsterdam, the Beurs van Berlage, which was occupied throughout the exhibit by artists and writers who answered in that space over time as they could and were free to, because they had the power to do so. I will talk a little bit now about the ICOM Code of Ethics and describe a little bit which points in the ICOM Code of Ethics, which you can refer to and complete on http icom.museum, and you can have that ICOM Code of Ethics in the 3 official languages, French, English, and Spanish, and in addition available today, I think, in 35 languages. This is not so much a debate about whether the artist or museum had a right to make an exhibit, but more specifically whether the museum professionals involved acted properly in including it in the exhibition, and then whether the director acted properly in countering the views of his colleagues, curators, and subordinating staff by excluding it once outside opposition and requests were made for its removal from a community claiming sacred connection to the imagery put on public display. Specifically, this is a case regarding the ethical position of the museum director and his professional practice in this instance, and might well include the ethical position of the curators and other museum professionals with regard to actions taken by the director. I'm happy to know that earlier on, the Smithsonian Institution museum policy was discussed, and that is part of the way the ICOM Code of Ethics looks at these situations. Museum policy and the legal framework of the country involved, which we just discussed, must be first and foremost in considerations with the standards and guidelines suggested. Should a museum, private, public, or otherwise, display to the public whatever it chooses? Should it have regard for the sensibilities of different constituent communities? And in a multicultural community context, and in a pluralistic community context, how can this be possible if the communities themselves are at loggerheads, or within a given community there is discord and dissent? What is the director's role regarding curators, staff, and the respect for the rights of the artist and the requests made from the communities? ICOM was founded in 1946 at the Louvre Museum at the instigation of a former American Association of Museums president and American delegate to the newly founded UNESCO, Chauncey Hamlin, along with Georges Lassalle, director of the French Museums, as an international exchange forum for national museums associations. The association mentioned of the American Association of Museum Directors and AAM both recognize the ICOM Code of Ethics and have their own codes of ethics. The AAM Code of Ethics predates the ICOM Code of Ethics by 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. The original ICOM code related to the ethics of acquisitions and basically regards matters concerning the acquisition of collections in different countries and in post-colonial context, colonial context at the time. It was the original ethics of acquisition, which preceded the code, was developed by Georges-Henri Rivière, ICOM's first director, and ICOM's second director, Hugues de Varine, both also responsible for the development of the Eco-Museum, l'Eco-Musée, the community museum, community, heritage, and territory being the idea of this museum. So the idea of community has been developing throughout the code itself. The relevant passages of the code for this debate are, I think, the principle number 4, that museums provide opportunities for the appreciation, understanding, and management of the natural and cultural heritage, that museums have an important duty to develop their educational role and attract wider audiences from the community, locality, or group they serve. Interaction with the constituent community and promotion of their heritage is an integral part of the educational role of the museum. Also, for one display and exhibition, for 3, exhibition of sensitive materials concerning human remains and materials of sacred significance. I'll come back to that. For 4, removal from public display. And in particular, this is the passage, requests for removal from public display of human remains or material of sacred significance from the originating communities must be addressed expeditiously with respect and sensitivity. Requests for the return has to do with the restitution context of such material should be addressed similarly as well. Museum policy should clearly define the process for responding to such requests. And the parts of the code that were revised in 2004 concerning communities most in particular, museums work in close collaboration with the communities from which their collections originate, as well as those they serve. Museum collections reflect the cultural and natural heritage of the communities from which they have been derived. As such, they have a character beyond that of ordinary property, which may include strong affinities with national, religious, local, ethnic, religious, or political identity. It is important, therefore, that museum policy is responsive to this situation. So a lot of the onus is placed on the development of good museum policy in this respect and in the particular context. Finally, 6.5, contemporary communities. Where museum activities involve a contemporary community or its heritage, acquisitions should only be made based on informed and mutual consent without exploitation of the owners or informants. And the final line, which stands alone, respect for the wishes of the community involved should be paramount. 6.6, funding. of community activities, when seeking funds for activities involving contemporary communities, their interests should not be compromised. 6.7, use of collections from contemporary communities is mostly regarding material from traditional cultures, which should be used with respect for human dignity, and that in this more anthropological or ethnographical context, such collections should be used to promote human well-being, social development, tolerance, and respect by advocating multi-social, multicultural, and multilingual expressions. 6.8 is also relevant. Okay, so as for the provisions concerning the display of sensitive collections likely to disturb communities due to the sacred nature of the objects, there are specific recommendations to take the wishes of the communities into account. As you might imagine, these provisions are intended for the context I was describing, but the spirit of the code can also be applied to the Catholic communities concerned in this debate about the depiction of Jesus on the cross. I won't go into the details of this. The Catholic League, and not the church hierarchy itself, was the main opponent, but we discussed that earlier, I believe. The argument that the video took away attention from the rest of the exhibition due to the media coverage might seem a bit misdirected. Resigning in protest to defend freedom of artistic expression, and more specifically the right to the freedom of curatorship, might seem courageous. For the issues at hand, the freedom of curating a show as an artistic expression itself is something to be considered, regardless of the funding or the public's potential concern. This was the opinion of Jeffrey Lewis, former chair of the ICOM Ethics Committee and former president of ICOM, regarding the famous Mapplethorpe show at the Corcoran. We can marvel at how little might have changed since then. His argument is still valid, is that no one is forced to attend an art show, except perhaps those school children who were dragged to see the Zizi Sexuelle, and that was the parents' point. You know, they didn't really know which museum and what they were saying. Thus, many of the problems regarding the use of the ICOM Code of Ethics for museums is in those cases such as this one, where the use of the term communities intertwines with the heart of the concept of political correctness. Both have become catchwords and largely depend on the context at hand. But in those cases where the two do mix, if of the communities concerned, at least one of these is a political party in power or in opposition, and the museum is a public entity, and therefore in part through its appointees at the top or its funding is an expression of that political color, then the ethics involved in this case and similar cases are those related to the professional ethics of museums and museum professionals. The freedom of expression relevant here is that of those professionals who exercise their functions according to museum policy and internationally accepted ethical standards. And it is more of a case of this than artistic freedom in and of itself, of the artist who in this case is deceased. I will skip over the resignation of the board member over the crucifix controversy and the press involved in the details of this case, the politicians involved, John Boner, Republican, Ohio, Eric Cantor, Republican, Virginia. The expeditious response given by Museum Director Martin Sullivan in a letter of response was, "Thank you for expressing your concern about the deletion," was the word used, "of David Wojnarowicz's video, A Fire in My Belly, from the National Portrait Gallery's Hide-Seek exhibition, and your support of the exhibition's importance. We've received thousands of emails and phone calls representing a mix of opinions. I want to assure you that your message has come through. As you know, more than 100 artworks are on view in the overall exhibition. More than a dozen works specifically address the tragic impact of AIDS. The exhibition continues to include 2 important works by David Wojnarowicz, as well as a portrait of him by Peter Hujar. The art was assembled from the Portrait Gallery's permanent collection of the museum itself, and from many other sources. It is presented together for the first time ever thanks to generous lenders and private financial supporters. We're grateful for that partnership and proud of the positive response from the many visitors who have experienced the exhibition. In addition, in his letter, Sullivan includes the Smithsonian's question and answer sheet about the controversy that it posted on its website. So this is just an example, and there's a lot of that from the web and different blogs and so on about the discussion and debate which was opened and maintained on this subject, of which this forum is an example as well. In an international context, the ICOM Code of Ethics states that in cases of conflict, if one were to say we can't make heads or tails of this, the ICOM Code of Ethics say the interests of the museum should prevail. So this too seems to undermine any idea of artistic freedom of curators who are public employees, even if they are only temporary consultants. You can go into detail about the actions of the different members and museum professionals involved, including board member James T. Bartlett. But I think the bigger issue, since there's not that much time probably, the interpretation of exhibits is that museums, according to the code, should ensure that the information they present in displays and exhibitions is well-founded, accurate, and gives appropriate consideration to represented groups or beliefs. That seems almost contradictory to an art museum, a contemporary art museum, or the expression of an individual artist. This case shows gaps in the code. This case shows gaps in international considerations of such issues, and I think that's why it's particularly useful and helpful. In terms of the removal from public display, it seems, with all of the above in mind, we conclude that from the International Museum's perspective, and in light notably of the UNESCO Convention of 2005 for the protection and promotion of expressions of cultural diversity, as well as the Freiburg Declaration on Cultural Rights, specifically allowing for a diverse appropriation of cultural symbolism, that this would be a great case for the ICOM Ethics Committee to discuss. We would suggest that the ICOM Code, which is considered the minimum standard of professional practice and performance for museums and their staff, something upon which to build, that this could help build it. In light of the ICOM Code of Ethics, National Portrait Gallery Director Martin Sullivan acted properly in taking into account the interests and beliefs of the members of the community, 4.3. And although the objects did not exactly originate from the Catholic League, and as intellectual property fall squarely within the domain of free artistic expression belonging to the artist who created the crucifix and ant composition as an original work on video, that the director did, in any case, act expeditiously in response in a short period of time to requests regarding materials of sacred significance, and that ultimately he reinforced the role of the museum in service to society by showing respect for the wishes of the community involved as being paramount. The legal and ethical status of the images in Fire in My Belly conflicts with the legal and ethical role of the museum director as a museum professional. And whereas its removal from the exhibition actually promoted the artwork through the controversy covered in the media, it was only denigrated by its detractors in the immediacy of advancing their own political agenda. Its actual exclusion from public display increased the number of viewers for both the film in other venues and for the exhibition in Washington and around the world. Therefore, the effects, not perhaps the intent behind the exclusion of the artwork, acted not as censorship to hide the piece from view, but through the provocative exclusion as an invitation to the global promotion through other art institutions around the world and online communities in growing numbers of a real happening whereby the projection of the film repeatedly immortalized through the image of the ant-covered Jesus itself, the suffering of one artist dying of AIDS, and entering into the controversial canon of contemporary art, David Wajnarowicz's video stands now alongside Roberto Rossellini's Il Miracolo with Federico Fellini's screenplay, vindicated as the right to free speech as per Justice Frankfurter's opinion in the 1952 US Supreme Court case overruling the ban of this film, and also aligns itself in a future mode with the international advances in the Freiburg Declaration of May 7th, 2007. The Freiburg Declaration of Cultural Rights, I invite you to read in full. I think we're almost done. And in particular, Article 5, where 4, 5, and 7, okay, where artists' rights are included in this picture, which is itself a work in progress, just like the ICOM Code of Ethics. The best case scenarios are like hide and seek, a case in point that develop the policies, codes, and conventions in new ways, filling in the gaps with real-life experiences of freedom of expression, as varied and different as that desire might be for individuals and communities worldwide. Thank you. Sorry.
Does anyone have any comments or questions to begin?
Can I show my pictures?
Of course.
If there are none, I took some time. I'm not a techie, so this is like beautiful from as far as I'm concerned in terms of the rest of the slide. But just some other words on the slide that I was not able to share with you. That's a show that occurred in 1984 that brought the advancing American art back to the American people. So I got the collections from Auburn, from the other university, and this is the cover of the catalog. This is one of the works that was in the show from Dallas, and unfortunately it's a very bad image, but it's the fisherman. And there's a mask, and one of the critics said that that mask looked like a Russian sickle figure. As I said, Dallas stood up against the critics primarily because of a very strong chair of the board, founder or associated with the Neiman Marcus store, Mr. Marcus. He had a reputation for being a very moral man. This is the artist who's circus girl resting. He figured in the early exhibition as well as the one that appeared at the Dallas show, which was supposed to go to Australia, and it was canceled, the Australia piece. Cuban Museum of Art. This was the matter of a lawsuit with the exhibition. The museum won the lawsuit. The city was forced to go off its demand that the museum move out of the city-owned building, and the museum closed down 8 years later, lost the funding from private sources. Corcoran, Mapplethorpe protest, and this was a suit brought against a student, against the city council, one of whom brandished a gun to remove the work from the wall. The case was finally settled for $95,000 compared to the $1 that was received by our artists in earlier. And of course, the famous work from the Brooklyn Museum of Art that was attacked by Rudy Giuliani, and we all know what happened, the outcome there.
Lisa, I
And
wanted to, maybe I had a question that I wanted to ask about that particular exhibition.
That's the end of my art.
About that particular exhibition, because, and I thought, Rachel, I thought you might have touched on it in this sort of international sphere, but that exhibition sensation was, I believe, at the Royal Academy, and then it was at Berlin, and it seemed to me there was no controversy whatsoever. And then it arrived in Brooklyn, and it became very popular because of the controversy. I know you mentioned a number of cases where Europe seemed a bit puritanical. But my own impression is that there's a much different liberal attitude in Europe than we have here in the United States.
Well, I really think it depends on where in Europe, and especially today. And I think what's interesting to look at is the particular cases with the particular politics involved, because the same institutional, whether it's in Europe or Africa or Asia or Latin America, I have a whole set of examples from different places that would just have gone on forever. We might as well do a book. And depending upon the institutional authority of the museums concerned, we have the appropriate political power involved that is in this mix. And it could be the city, in the case of the city of Paris, I was dealing with public museums, but they were maybe a city museum. In the case of, or it could be a national museum, or there are just many more public institutions worldwide compared to the American situation, where predominantly museums are private museums, except for the Smithsonian. Right. And that's why the Smithsonian is always the case that resembles most what goes on in the rest of the world. It's really what goes on in all the other museums that tends to be distinguished, because, for example, the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi is not an issue, whereas the Louvre in Abu Dhabi is a big issue.
We have a question or a comment.
Yeah, both. There's a big sensation, by the way, was controversial in Britain before it came to the Brooklyn Museum. It was controversial for a different piece, the Myra Handley piece, where a child abductor and murderess was represented by children's hands. The big difference between the US and Europe, and I think we haven't really talked that much about that, is the intervention of politicians. So something is controversial in Europe, okay, museums decide, they make internal decisions. In the United States, it's politicians that intervene, and we were talking about the role of Clough and the role of Marty Sullivan. We haven't spoken so much about the ethics of what Representatives Boehner and Cantor did, which is basically threaten the museum. If you're not going to remove this because some of our extreme constituencies don't like it, we are going to pull your funding. And, I actually don't quite agree that the government can decide what is in museums or not, but they can decide to fund or not a museum. So, but this was a direct threat. This was saying, if you do not conform to our viewpoints, we are going to punish you financially. And I just want to compare it to one thing, to Angela Merkel in Germany, who, when Idomeneo was about to be censored because in the opera production there were images of Jesus, Muhammad, and Buddha, Angela Merkel intervened and said, we have free speech. You have to have this production. So we don't have a politician here intervening on the side of free speech. Democrats in Congress have been entirely silent throughout this whole brouhaha. Republicans have been attacking, and they're still attacking the Smithsonian. They're about now to discuss the funding of the Smithsonian, and they are bringing hide and seek as a way to attack funding. The National Endowment for the Arts, that has been very uncontroversial for the last 10 years, its funding is still attacked. The agency is, there are GOP members who want to defund the agency. So is this kind of politicians acting as art curators in this country that is rather unique and ethically suspect to me.
Thank you. We have a comment?
Well, I was looking forward to the scheduled hearing this week on funding for the Smithsonian, and hoping that would shed light on that political reaction. However, that hearing was canceled due to the budget crisis. But in any event, I think you're right. I think that politicians are getting, or not getting, I think they've always had an idea about what they think is either obscene or right or wrong, and even the Supreme Court once said that in a ruling that I don't know what obscenity is, but I know it when I see it, and so it suggests that pornography, sorry, thank you, but similar issue, and knowing it when they see it, it's a very subjective viewpoint. And I had a question too about whether there have been instances in other parts of the world that you're familiar with where funding was premised upon, the content of exhibitions, or whether, funding to a museum or arts institution was premised upon what the content was?
As I say, I think there must be many examples. The only thing I have in mind right now is this whole there are different laws in France and in Great Britain of the non-alienation of cultural property that belongs to the people, the state. And this Louvre in Abu Dhabi was a sale of basically a loan. It's considered actually a lease, like a long-term lease, like a car lease. It's not actually a sale, but a very long-term lease of the name, the institution of the Louvre, the personnel and staff of museum professionals from the Louvre, and significant number of collections of the Louvre being displaced outside of France to Abu Dhabi.
Lisa, excuse me, Rachel wanted to answer that question.
And that's a lot of money. It's more, the only thing in terms of the funding is this funding, according to the ICOM Code of Ethics, all funding, all gains that museums, nonprofit museums make should return to enhance the institution and increase perhaps collections or acquisitions or improvements in the museum's running itself. So there is now, I think it's 700 billion euros. It's an amazing amount of money, and that is now supposed to be a fund that returns to the government of France, cashing in on that. And the museums of France are looking for where that money, how that money is coming back to them.
Rachel, did you want to say something?
I know your question is focused on Washington, but one of the cases that I was not able to present on arose in October 2010 in Colorado. And your organization was very instrumental in that matter. It was an exhibit led by a clergyman that objected. Councilmen stepped forward and also joined the objection, asking that the work be removed from the exhibit. Fortunately, the district attorney in that town wrote a favorable opinion upholding the fact that the artwork that was challenged was in fact protected by the First Amendment. Your organization wrote a letter as well pointing out how Brooklyn Museum had prevailed in their case against the city. There was a city council meeting, public came and addressed it, and the city council person that led the initial assault said, and I quote, he admitted he had an exaggerated response to the artwork. And that was so refreshing to hear a politician say that. What is also interesting is that one of the public who testified at the city council in terms of ethics, in terms of where we're going to go in the future, he stated, it is art, the challenged work. Art that satirizes almost everything. Is it good art? I don't know. None of us is the community's art czar, and thank goodness for that. Whatever you think of this work, please treat each other with respect, and please do not demonize and disrespect with those with whom we disagree. What can be said about going forward?
Can we send them to Congress?
Does anyone else have any questions? Thank you all three. It was wonderful. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.